Alistair, the ninth Duke of Blackwood, considered his marriage a matter of estate management. It was a line item in the great ledger of his life, a duty to be fulfilled with the same dispassionate efficiency he applied to crop rotation and timber yields. He required a duchess. The title demanded it. The lineage required an heir, and the vast, echoing halls of Blackwood Manor demanded a chatelaine to oversee the polishing of silver and the airing of linens. He was a man who appreciated order above all else, and a wife was a key component of a well-ordered life. He had selected Miss Eleanor Vance for a series of eminently practical reasons. Her family, though recently and disastrously impoverished, possessed a lineage as old and respected as his own. She was reputedly quiet, possessed of a placid temperament, and was unburdened by the sort of flighty, romantic notions that Alistair found so tedious in other young women. She was, in short, suitable, uncomplicated. He had met her twice, in carefully orchestrated settings, before the solicitors were engaged. She had said little, her gaze calm, and her hands still in her lap. He registered her presence as one might register a new piece of furniture, well made, unobtrusive, and fit for purpose. The wedding was a cool, elegant affair in a London church, smelling of old stone and beeswax. Eleanor was a pale, slender figure in ivory silk. Alistair stood beside her, feeling not a flutter of nerves or anticipation, but merely the quiet satisfaction of a task being completed. He spoke his vows in a clear, steady voice. He placed the heavy gold band on her finger. He was now a married man. The ledger was balanced. That evening, in the cavernous ducal study at his London residence, he poured himself a brandy. The day's obligations were met. He sat at the great mahogany desk, its surface a testament to his own mind, ordered, polished, and bearing the weight of immense responsibility. He took out a sheet of his heavy, cream-laid paper to write to his oldest friend, Lord Ashworth. It was a habit, this distillation of his life into dry, factual prose. He dipped his pen. He wrote of parliamentary business, of a promising colt at his stables, and then, as a matter of course, he wrote of his new wife. He paused, staring at the nib of the pen. What was there to say? She was present. He sought for words. "The matter is concluded," he wrote. "The new duchess is installed. She is as advertised, comely enough, and her bloodlines are impeccable. One cannot fault her composure." He swirled the brandy in his glass, considering. Ashworth, a man of appetites and boisterous opinions, would expect more. A more personal assessment. Alistair thought of Eleanor at dinner. She had sat at the far end of the long, gleaming table, a silent porcelain doll. She had eaten little, spoken not at all unless addressed directly, and her eyes had surveyed the room with a disconcerting stillness. He had expected her to show some interest, to ask about the household, to begin the process of taking up her duties. She had not. She had simply existed. There was a passivity to her he found both reassuring and vaguely disappointing. He finished the thought in a final, dismissive sentence. "She has no taste for hard work, I suspect, but she is placid enough. It will suffice." It was a judgment delivered with the casual arrogance of a man who had never once in his life had to wonder where his next meal was coming from, nor how the sheets on his bed came to be clean. He signed the letter, folded it, but did not seal it. His man would do that in the morning, before it went out with the post. He left it lying beside the inkwell, a pale rectangle in the soft lamplight, and forgot about it entirely. The first weeks at Blackwood Manor settled into a routine of quiet distance. The Duke was consumed by his work. He spent his days with his estate manager, his solicitor, or locked in his study, with ledgers that stretched back 3 centuries. The sheer scale of the Blackwood holdings was immense, a kingdom of tenant farms, mines, and forests that required constant, vigilant oversight. It was the work he understood. It was the work he respected. His wife, the new duchess, seemed to drift through the great house like a ghost. He would see her, in the long gallery, her fingers tracing the frame of a portrait. He would pass her in the garden, a book resting unread in her lap. She took her meals, sometimes with him in strained silence, sometimes alone. The household, under the stern and capable eye of Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper, ran as it always had. Alistair noted, with a detached sort of approval, that his wife did not interfere. She did not disrupt the systems he had so carefully maintained. She was, as he had predicted, placid, but a strange thing began to happen, so subtly at first that he did not consciously register it. The house began to change. It started with the food. The menus, which for years had been a predictable rotation of heavy roasts and overboiled vegetables, began to show flickers of imagination. There was a trout, perfectly cooked with almonds, that had been caught in the estate's own river that morning. A delicate soup made with fresh sorrel from the kitchen garden. A dessert of honeyed pears that tasted of autumn itself. Alistair found himself, for the first time in years, actually anticipating his meals. He made a mental note to commend the cook. Then there was the library. It was his sanctuary, a magnificent two-story room lined with books from floor to ceiling. But it was also a place of mild, persistent frustration. The cataloging system was archaic, organized by the date of acquisition rather than by subject or author. Finding a specific text on agricultural theory or mineral rights could take the better part of an hour. One afternoon, searching for a treatise on land enclosure, he went to the section where he vaguely remembered seeing it years ago. It was not there. In its place, he found the entire collection of agricultural works gathered together, alphabetized by author. It was a miracle of logic and order. He stood, dumbfounded, for a full minute. He assumed his secretary, a diligent but uninspired young man named Finch, had finally taken the initiative. Small comforts appeared, a fresh bouquet of late-blooming roses on his desk, their scent cutting through the dry smell of paper and ink. A footstool, placed just so by his reading chair, in the evening. The fire in his study was always lit now before he arrived, catching perfectly, casting a warm and steady glow. His world, which had always been functional, was becoming pleasant. The machinery of his life was suddenly running with a new, silent, and highly efficient grace. He attributed it to a general improvement in his staff's morale. Perhaps the presence of a duchess, however passive, had inspired them to greater efforts. He did not question it further. He was a man who focused on outcomes, not processes. The outcome was favorable. That was sufficient. The first crack in his carefully constructed perception of his wife came during a dinner party. It was a necessary evil of his station, these gatherings of local gentry and political allies. He sat at the head of the table, half listening to the pompous pronouncements of Sir Walter Croft on the Corn Laws. Eleanor was seated to his right, a silent, elegant fixture. Sir Walter was holding forth, his voice booming. "It is a matter of protecting our national interest. To allow foreign grain to flood our markets would be the ruin of the English farmer." A general murmur of agreement went around the table. Alistair was about to make a non-committal remark to move the conversation along when a quiet voice spoke. "But is the interest of the tenant farmer the same as the interest of the landowner, Sir Walter?" The voice was Eleanor's. It was soft, yet it cut through the room's low hum with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. Every head turned towards her. Alistair froze, his wineglass halfway to his lips. Sir Walter blinked, momentarily flustered. "Well, of course, my dear Duchess. Their interests are intertwined. A prosperous estate means prosperous tenants." "Does it?" Eleanor's gaze was level. She was not looking at Sir Walter, but at a point just past his shoulder, as if examining the logic of his statement itself. "I was reading an account of the Blackwood estate ledgers from the last decade. It seems that when grain prices were highest, the rents were raised proportionally, but the wages for day laborers on the home farm remained stagnant. So the estate's profits soared, but the man who tilled the soil was no better off. In fact, as the price of bread rose, he was arguably worse off. His interest does not seem to have been intertwined at all. It seems to have been sacrificed. A profound silence descended upon the table. The information was not only accurate, it was devastatingly so. It was a detail Alistair himself had noted with some disquiet months earlier. He had intended to address it, but other matters had taken precedence. He stared at his wife. She had not raised her voice. She had not been emotional. She had simply presented a series of facts with cool, unassailable clarity. She had taken Sir Walter's blustering argument and dismantled it, piece by piece, leaving him sputtering like a landed fish. Sir Walter mumbled something about complex factors and quickly changed the subject. For the rest of the evening, the conversation remained resolutely shallow, but Alistair could not stop thinking about it. He had assumed her reading was a pastime, a way to fill her empty days. He had never imagined she was reading the estate ledgers. He had never imagined she was capable of that level of analysis. It was a recalibration, a small, unsettling adjustment to his understanding of the woman he had married. He found it both impressive and vaguely irritating. It complicated the simple, placid image he had formed of her. He preferred things to be simple. He dismissed it as an anomaly, a surprising parlor trick from a woman who had, for a moment, stepped out of character. A week later, Eleanor went to his study in search of a better pen nib. Her own had become crossed and was spattering ink across her household accounts. The Duke was out, riding the boundaries of the North Woods. The room was empty, filled with the quiet, masculine scent of leather and old paper. She approached the great desk. It was, as always, a model of order. A neat stack of letters to be answered, a pile of documents bound in ribbon, and there, beside the silver inkstand, was an unsealed letter, written in the Duke's strong, decisive hand. It was addressed to Lord Ashworth. She had no intention of reading it. It was not in her nature to pry. But, as she reached for the small wooden box containing the pen nibs, her eye caught her own title. The New Duchess. Curiosity, a feeling she rarely indulged, stirred within her. She hesitated for only a second. Her life had become a thing of quiet observation from behind a veil of invisibility. To read the letter felt less like a transgression and more like an act of self-preservation, a chance to finally see how she was seen. Her fingers, steady and sure, picked up the sheet. She read the lines about Parliament, about the colt. Then she came to it, the assessment. Comely enough, impeccable bloodlines, composure. She felt a familiar, dull ache. It was the language of the auction block. She was a broodmare, a piece of fine porcelain. She read on, her heart beating a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. She has no taste for hard work, I suspect, but she is placid enough. It will suffice. The words did not provoke tears. Tears were a luxury she could not afford. Instead, they landed with the cold, hard finality of a prison sentence. No taste for hard work. She thought of the past month, of rising at dawn to go over the menus with the cook, gently suggesting ingredients from their own gardens, to save on costs and improve the quality. Of spending 3 full days in the dusty, cold library, painstakingly recataloguing the agricultural section so the Duke could find his precious treatises. Of sitting with Mrs. Gable for hours, untangling the linen inventory, discovering a discrepancy that suggested a supplier had been overcharging them for years. Of walking the gardens with the head gardener, a man of immense pride and little knowledge of crop rotation, and delicately persuading him to try a 3-field system in the kitchen garden that would improve the soil and yield more produce. Of noticing the frayed cuff on the Duke's favorite shirt and mending it herself, with stitches so small they were nearly invisible. All of it, every moment of effort, every quiet act of improvement, every ounce of intelligence and care she had poured into this cold, magnificent house, had been utterly and completely unseen. It was not the insult that wounded her, it was the blindness, the absolute, profound, and arrogant blindness of the man she had married. He had looked at her and seen nothing but a decorative, idle object. He had benefited from her labor, while simultaneously dismissing her as being incapable of it. A strange calm settled over her. It was the calm of a general who has just seen the enemy's entire strategy laid bare. She was not angry. She was resolved. With meticulous care, she folded the letter precisely along its original creases. She placed it back on the desk, aligning it perfectly with the edge of the blotter. She did not take a new pen nib. She no longer needed one. The household accounts could wait. She walked out of the study and quietly closed the door behind her. And with that soft click of the latch, a door inside her also closed. The work was done. Not her work for the house, but the Duke's work of defining her. He had made his judgment. Now he could live with it. The unraveling began the next day. Alistair, of course, did not notice at first. He was a man who noticed outcomes, and the outcomes took time to shift. He came down to breakfast and was served the familiar, slightly greasy kedgeree that had been standard before his marriage. He ate it without comment, his mind already on a dispute with a tenant farmer. At dinner, the heavy, predictable roast beef was back. The vegetables were watery. He felt a flicker of disappointment, but said nothing. A week passed. The house began to feel different. It was a change in atmosphere, a subtle dissonance he could not name. The flowers on his desk were not replaced when they wilted. The fire in his study was no longer lit in advance. He had to stoop and light it himself, getting smoke in his eyes. He reached for his favorite shirt one morning and found the cuff, which had been fraying again, had been crudely mended with thick, obvious stitches by one of the laundry maids. He frowned, irritated by the clumsiness of the repair. Then the larger problems began. He sent his secretary, Finch, to the library for the recatalogued agricultural books, wanting to reference the very treatise on enclosure he had found so easily weeks before. Finch returned an hour later, flustered and empty-handed. "I am sorry, Your Grace. I cannot find it. The entire section is in disarray. It seems someone began to reorganize it and then abandoned the effort halfway through." Alistair stared at him. Disarray? It was perfectly ordered last week. He stormed to the library himself. Finch was right. The books were in a state of partial chaos. Some were alphabetized, others were stacked in piles on the floor. The simple, elegant logic he had admired was gone, replaced by a muddle. It was infuriating. He began to feel a constant, low-grade irritation. The machinery of his life was no longer running smoothly. It was grinding. There were squeaks and jolts. He missed a crucial meeting in London because the invitation, which had arrived a week prior, was discovered under a pile of unimportant circulars on a side table. His correspondence, which had briefly been a model of prioritized efficiency, was once again a chaotic mess that his secretary could not seem to master. He was present, and she was absent. She was there, and she was not there. He noticed, with a growing sense of unease, the silence. The house had always been quiet, but this was a different quality of silence. It was an empty silence. He realized, with a jolt, that he had not heard his wife playing the pianoforte in the evenings. Before, its soft melodies had been a distant, pleasant backdrop to his work. He had not consciously noted its presence, but he felt its absence keenly. It was like a clock that had stopped ticking. The silence it left behind was louder than the sound it had made. His wife was as placid as ever. She sat at the dinner table, a perfect, still portrait of a duchess. But her stillness was no longer serene. It was vacant. Her eyes, which had once held a quiet, observant light, were now shuttered. She answered his direct questions with polite monosyllables. She offered no conversation. She made no insightful, unsettling comments. She simply was. She was exactly the woman he had described in his letter, and he found he could not bear it. His irritation mounted. He snapped at the footman. He berated his secretary for his incompetence. He paced the halls of his great, cold house, feeling like a stranger in his own home. Something was fundamentally wrong, and he could not identify the source of the malfunction. The entire system was failing, and he, the master of systems, was powerless to fix it. The breaking point came a month after Eleanor had read the letter. Alistair was in his study, staring at a plate of cold, congealed mutton that had been sent up for his lunch. It was inedible. The cook, who had shown such promise, had reverted entirely to her old, dreadful habits. In a fit of temper, he swept the plate onto the floor, where it shattered on the hearthstones. At that moment, Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper, entered the room. She was a tall, severe woman who had served the Blackwood family for 40 years. She looked at the Duke, at his furious face, and then at the mess on the floor. Her expression did not change. "Is there a problem, Your Grace?" she asked, her voice as dry as autumn leaves. "A problem?" Alistair's voice was tight with rage. "Look at this house, Mrs. Gable. It is falling apart. The food is inedible. My papers are in chaos. Nothing is where it should be. What is wrong with everyone?" Mrs. Gable surveyed him with a gaze that held no deference, only a deep, weary wisdom. She had seen him grow from a boy into a man, and she was not intimidated by his ducal anger. She bent stiffly and began to pick up the larger pieces of the broken plate. "Things were running so smoothly for a time, Your Grace," she said, her voice neutral, yet carrying an unmistakable weight. "When the Duchess first took an interest." The sentence hung in the air between them. It was not an accusation. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the quiet finality of a gavel falling. "When the Duchess first took an interest." The word struck Alistair with the force of a physical blow. A cascade of images flooded his mind. The perfect trout, the reorganized library, the scented roses on his desk, his mended shirt, the intelligent, devastating comment about the Corn Laws. He thought about the slow, inexorable decay of the past month, the bland food, the chaotic library, the wilted flowers, the silence. He thought about his wife, the placid, vacant woman who now sat at his table. An aphora began to pound in his head. He thought about the work. He thought about the grace. He thought about the silence. He thought about the absence. His gaze flew to his desk, to the spot where he had left the letter to Ashworth. It was an instinct, a sudden, desperate need to see it, to touch the source of this dawning, horrifying revelation. He strode to the desk and saw it, tucked neatly into a pigeonhole. He pulled it out. The paper felt different in his hand, thinner, somehow, more pliable. He opened it. The creases were soft, worn, as if it had been folded and unfolded not once, but many times. She had read it. The knowledge crashed over him, not as a wave, but as an entire ocean. It was a cataclysm of understanding that obliterated the world he had built for himself. The arrogance of his judgment, the sheer, monumental stupidity of his blindness. He had held a diamond in his hand and declared it to be common glass. She has no taste for hard work. The words echoed in his skull, a testament to his own idiocy. The hard work had been all around him, silent, invisible, and constant. She had not been idle. She had been performing 100 small miracles a day, transforming his cold, functional house into a home. And he, in his magnificent ignorance, had not seen a single one. He had seen a placid woman. He had seen an ornament. He had seen nothing. He sank into his chair, the letter clenched in his fist. He was not just wrong. He had been a fool, a blind, arrogant, colossal fool. And the quiet, competent woman he had so casually dismissed had performed one last act of perfect, chilling competence. She had given him exactly what he had said he wanted. A placid wife, a duchess who did nothing. She had become the woman from his letter, and the silence in the house was the sound of her victory. He sat there for a long time, the shattered plate forgotten on the floor. The rage had vanished, replaced by a cold, hollow feeling in the pit of his stomach. It was the feeling of profound, irreversible loss. He had broken something far more valuable than a piece of china. He had broken the delicate, invisible threads of care and effort that his wife had been weaving around him. He had not even known they were there until they were gone. He had to find her. He stood, his movements stiff. He left the study, ignoring Mrs. Gable, who was now quietly sweeping the last of the shards into a dustpan. He walked through the silent house, his footsteps echoing on the marble floors. He did not know where he was going, only that he had to find her. He checked the drawing room, the morning room, the long gallery. They were all empty, pristine, and cold. It was in the gardens that he finally found her. He went to the formal rose garden first, a place of geometric precision and manicured perfection. She was not there. An instinct, a faint memory of a conversation he had barely listened to, guided him further. She had mentioned it once, a few weeks ago, her voice soft. There is an old walled garden behind the east wing. It has been neglected for years. The roses are all wild and overgrown. I should like to see it restored one day. He had nodded, his mind on timber prices, and had immediately forgotten her words. He found the gate, its ironwork rusted and tangled with ivy. He pushed it open. The garden within was a beautiful ruin. Ancient rose bushes, thick as a man's arm, sprawled in chaotic profusion, their blossoms a riot of crimson and pale pink against the weathered brick of the walls. The air was thick with their wild, sweet scent. And there, on a crumbling stone bench, sat Eleanor. She was not reading. She was simply looking at a particularly thorny, overgrown bush, her hands resting in the lap of her gray wool dress. She looked up as he approached, her expression unreadable. It was not welcoming. It was not hostile. It was neutral, the dispassionate gaze of a stranger. He stopped a few feet away from her. The air was heavy with unspoken things. He had prepared no speech. Excuses felt like a further insult. All he had was the raw, brutal truth of his own failure. I was wrong, he said. The words felt small, inadequate to the scale of his error, but they were the only place to begin. She did not respond. She continued to look at him, her stillness a form of judgment more potent than any tirade. He took a breath. The letter. To Ashworth. I know you read it. He saw a flicker in her eyes, the barest acknowledgement. Everything I wrote in that letter was an error, not an error of judgment, but an error of perception. I was blind. I looked at you, and I did not see you. He took a step closer. I saw a name, a lineage, a placid presence to fill a space in my house. I did not see a woman who mended my shirts. I did not see a mind that could cut through pompous fools at my dinner table. I did not see the person who brought order to my library and life to my household. I benefited from your work, every hour of every day, and in the same breath, I dismissed you as being incapable of it. There is no excuse for that level of arrogance, for that level of stupidity. He stopped. He had confessed his sin. He had laid his foolishness bare. He waited. Eleanor's gaze shifted from his face to the overgrown rosebush beside her. This variety, she said, her voice quiet and even, is called maiden's blush. It is very old. It only blooms once, but it is famously resilient. It can survive decades of neglect, but it requires a severe pruning to flower well again. You have to cut it back almost to the ground. You have to be ruthless. She turned her eyes back to him. They were clear and cold as winter water. What precisely do you intend to do, Your Grace? The question was not emotional. It was practical. It was the question of a manager, an accountant, a partner. It was the question of a woman who had been dealing in facts while he had been dealing in assumptions. She was not asking for an apology. She was asking for a plan of action. It was in that moment that Alistair understood. Atonement was not a matter of words. It was a matter of work. His work. I intend, he said slowly, meeting her gaze without flinching, to learn how to see. The next morning, Alistair summoned his estate manager, a man named Davies, to his study. For years, Davies had presented reports that were adequate, but always vaguely troubling. There were discrepancies, shortfalls, that were explained away with talk of bad weather or lazy tenants. Alistair had accepted them. Eleanor, in one of her few, brief remarks on estate matters, had once said, "Mr. Davies seems more concerned with the appearance of solvency than the fact of it." Alistair had dismissed it as an uninformed feminine opinion. Now, he remembered her words. He began to ask Davies questions. Not the usual questions, but sharp, specific inquiries based on the figures Eleanor had been studying in the household accounts. He asked about the cost of seed grain versus the market price. He asked about the yield from the South Meadow, which seemed inexplicably low. Davies began to sweat. His answers became evasive. By noon, the truth was unspooling. Davies had been systematically cheating the estate for years, selling off a portion of the harvest for his own profit and falsifying the records. By afternoon, Davies was dismissed, publicly. Alistair did not hide the reason. He let it be known throughout the estate that the manager had been a thief. Then he did something that shocked his solicitor to the core. He sent a message to the Duchess, who was in her rooms, formally requesting her assistance in reviewing the applications for a new manager. It was a beginning. Eleanor did not immediately capitulate. She did not rush to his side. Her forgiveness offered freely. When she came to the study that evening, she was composed and professional. She carried a small notebook with her. She did not sit in the chair reserved for a visitor, but took a seat at the wide desk opposite him, as an equal would. They did not speak of the letter. They spoke of the estate. She pointed out other areas of inefficiency, her word for theft and incompetence. She had noticed that the cost of repairs to the tenant cottages was nearly double what it should be. She suspected the builder was in league with the old manager. She suggested they source their own timber and hire local men to do the work, cutting out the middleman entirely. Her knowledge was encyclopedic. Her insights were devastatingly acute. She had, in her quiet, invisible way, learned more about the running of his dukedom in 2 months than he had in the last 5 years. He was humbled. He was awed. So began the rebuilding. It was not a period of romantic gestures. It was a period of shared labor. He did not send her flowers. He asked for her opinion on drainage tiles. He did not write her poetry. He listened as she explained her proposal for a school for the tenants' children, funded by the money recovered from the corrupt builder. He started to watch her, not as a duke observing a duchess, but as a man observing a woman. He noticed the way a small, thoughtful frown appeared between her brows when she studied a ledger. He noticed the dry, startling wit that surfaced in her comments when she was relaxed. He learned that her favorite composer was Scarlatti, and that she played his sonatas with a fiery precision that was anything but placid. He noticed her. He began to actively seek her out, not just for work, but for her company. He would find her in the library, their library now, properly catalogued and organized, and simply sit with her, each of them reading their own books in a comfortable, shared silence. The silence was no longer empty. It was full. One evening, he came across her correspondence. On her desk was a letter from his friend, Lord Ashworth. It was an invitation to a house party, flowery and presumptuous. It included a line that made Alistair's blood run cold. "Do come, my dear Duchess, and relieve us of our boredom. We hear you are a most decorative addition to Blackwood." It was his own sin, his own careless words, thrown back at him. He felt a surge of protective fury, so intense it startled him. The next day, he rode to London. He found Ashworth at his club. He did not raise his voice. He spoke in a low, glacial tone that was far more terrifying than any shout. He informed Ashworth that his friendship was at an end. He made it clear that any man who spoke of his wife with anything less than the utmost respect would find himself an enemy of the Duke of Blackwood. The message, and the career-ending threat it contained, was unmistakable. When he returned to Blackwood, he did not tell Eleanor what he had done, but she knew. He saw it in the way she looked at him across the dinner table that night. There was a new light in her eyes, a warmth that had not been there before. The final piece of the old arrangement fell away one rainy afternoon. He found her in the walled garden. The change there was remarkable. The overgrown bushes had been ruthlessly pruned, just as she had said they must be. The paths were cleared. New plantings were laid out. It was no longer a ruin, but a place of promise, of future beauty. She was on her knees, her hands covered in dirt, carefully tending to a young rose cutting. She looked up at him, a smudge of earth on her cheek, and for the first time, she smiled. A genuine, unguarded smile that transformed her entire face. He felt his heart turn over. "I have come to understand," he said, his voice husky, "that the original contract of our marriage was flawed. It was based on false assumptions and incomplete data. I would like to propose a new one." She tilted her head, waiting. "A partnership," he said, "in all things. A marriage. A real one. If you will have me, Eleanor." She looked at him for a long moment, her gaze searching his. Then she held out her dirt-streaked hand to him. He took it and pulled her to her feet. 1 year later, the walled garden was in full, riotous bloom. The maiden's blush roses, having been cut back to their essential strength, were covered in a profusion of pale, fragrant blossoms. The entire estate was flourishing under the joint management of the Duke and Duchess of Blackwood. It was more prosperous, more efficient, and more humane than it had ever been. The house was no longer cold. It was filled with life, with the sound of music, with the scent of baking bread and fresh flowers. It was a home. Alistair stood in the doorway of the study, watching his wife. She sat at the great desk, their desk, a slight, new curve to her belly, just visible beneath her gown. An heir was coming. But the thought of it was no longer about duty or lineage. It was about love. It was the joyful, terrifying, and wondrous culmination of their shared life. She was deep in conversation with the new estate manager, pointing to a map and explaining a complex point about water rights. Her voice was clear, confident, and intelligent. She was magnificent. He thought back to the man he had been, the cold, arrogant Duke, who had looked at this brilliant, capable woman and seen nothing. The man who had written that foolish, damning letter. He remembered the empty, silent house. He remembered the taste of cold mutton and despair. He had been so certain of his own perceptions, so wrapped in the logic of his own world, that he had failed to see the truth standing right in front of him. The hardest work had not been Eleanor's alone, in her quiet, thankless efforts to bring order and grace to his life. The hardest work had been his, the painful, humbling, and ultimately joyous work of learning to see, of learning to notice, of tearing down the edifice of his own pride, to find the woman who had been there all along, waiting. She looked up then and saw him. Her face broke into that rare, beautiful smile that was his alone. "Alistair," she said, "come and settle this. Mr. Henderson thinks I am being too ambitious." He smiled back, a real smile that reached his eyes. "I highly doubt it," he said, walking into the room to stand by her side. "I have found, Mr. Henderson, that the Duchess is never too ambitious. She is simply correct." He placed a hand on her shoulder, and she leaned into his touch. It was a small gesture, but it held the weight of their entire world, a world they had built together, out of the ruins of a foolish mistake and the resilient strength of a love that had been ruthlessly pruned, only to bloom more brilliantly than ever. If you made it to the end of this story, thank you for listening. Tell me in the comments, if you were the Duchess, what one condition would you have added to his unspoken atonement? Please consider leaving a like and subscribe for more stories like this one. A governess with a secret, a widowed marquis with a haunted past, and a wing of the house that has been locked for a generation. They arrive here, at this channel, whenever they are ready.